The airport terminal was filled with the familiar rhythm of modern travel. Rolling suitcases glided across polished floors. Electronic announcements echoed from distant speakers, and travelers moved in quiet urgency toward their gates. Some carried the confidence of seasoned flyers, while others walked with the quiet wonder of those stepping into the sky for the first time. Among the crowd stood a man whose presence seemed out of place in the world of luxury flights and polished. Shoes as clothes were simple, worn by years of honest work beneath the sun. His hands were rough, marked with the deep lines of labor that could never be washed away. The scent of soil still clung faintly to him, reminder of fields far away from the steel and glass walls of the airport. He was a farmer. For most travelers, the journey was routine. For him, it was something entirely different. Every step toward. The boarding gate carried both curiosity and quiet uncertainty. He held his boarding pass carefully, almost respectfully, as if it were something fragile. Flying had never been part of his life. His days usually began before sunrise and ended long after the sky had turned dark. Airplanes were distant shapes that crossed the sky above his fields, symbols of a world far removed from his own. But today, his life had taken a rare turn. Somewhere beyond the clouds waited a reason strong enough to bring him here. When boarding began, passengers lined up according to their zones. The farmer waited patiently near the end of the line, allowing others to move ahead of him. He seemed in no hurry, quietly observing the organized chaos around him. Eventually, his turn came. The aircraft cabin greeted him with cool air, soft lighting, and rows of narrow seats that seemed both fascinating and confusing. Flight attendants smiled politely as passengers passed, their voices calm and practiced. He followed the seat numbers slowly, counting the rows with careful attention. Then he found it. Seat 1 for B. The middle seat to his left was the window, already occupied by a man dressed in an expensive tailored suit. The man looked polished and successful, the kind of person who moved through life with the quiet expectation that the world would arrange itself in his favor. His watch gleamed under the cabin lights. His shoes were spotless. His laptop bag rested perfectly beneath the seat. The farmer paused for a moment before sitting, but the moment the businessman noticed him, something shifted. The air between them seemed to tighten. The wealthy passenger's eyes briefly scanned the farmer from head to toe. It was a quick glance, but long enough to form a judgment. The worn boots, the faded shirt, the weathered hands. Every detail seemed to speak a language the businessman had already decided he did not want to understand. The farmer slowly placed his small bag in the overhead compartment. He carefully lowered himself into the middle seat, and then the discomfort began. The businessman leaned slightly away, his expression tightening with visible irritation. His body language made the message clear without the need for words. This was not the kind of company he expected. Around them, the cabin continued, filling with passengers. Laughter, seatbelts clicking, overhead bins closing. The world moved normally. Unaware of the silent tension building in row 14, the farmer sat quietly, his hands folded gently in his lap. He seemed unaware of the judgment sitting beside him, or perhaps he simply chose not to acknowledge it. Years of working the land had taught him patience. Outside the window, the sky was slowly dimming into evening. Inside the plane, something far heavier than clouds had begun to gather. The wealthy passenger finally pressed the call button above his seat. A flight attendant arrived moments later with a polite smile. The businessman leaned toward her slightly, speaking in a lowered voice. Though the exact words were not heard by others nearby, the intention was clear from his tone and posture. His request carried a quiet complaint, the kind that believed money and status should solve small inconveniences. The inconvenience, in his mind, was the farmer sitting beside him. The flight attendant listened carefully. Her professional smile never faded, but her eyes briefly moved toward the farmer. The farmer remained still, looking forward with quiet calm. There was no anger in his face, no embarrassment. Only the simple stillness of someone used to standing quietly while the world decided what to think of him. The attendant nodded politely to the businessman and stepped away. A few minutes passed. Passengers finished settling in. The cabin doors closed with a heavy sound that echoed through the aircraft. Engines hummed softly outside, but before the plane began moving, something unexpected happened. The flight attendant returned, accompanied by another crew member. They spoke briefly with the businessman again. This time his voice grew slightly sharper, his discomfort more visible. Several nearby passengers began noticing the situation. Curious glances started, peering across the rows. Some wondered if there had been a seating mistake. Others sensed something deeper beneath the moment. The farmer, however, remained silent. His eyes rested calmly on the seat in front of him, the same quiet patience that helped crops grow slowly beneath. The soil now helped him endure the quiet storm forming around him. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant picked up the intercom microphone. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane prepared for departure, and then the voice of the pilot filled the aircraft. It was calm, steady, and professional. But the words that followed would soon turn a small moment of judgment into something no one on that flight would ever forget. The announcement had not yet been made, but the entire cabin was about to hear something that would change the atmosphere of that flight forever, and the man in the expensive suit had no idea that the seat he refused to share was about to teach him the most humbling lesson of his life. The aircraft engine slowly roared to life, and the pilot began to speak. The low hum of the aircraft engine slowly deepened as the plane prepared for departure. Passengers settled into their seats, fastening seatbelts and placing their belongings under the chairs in front of them. The quiet bustle of pre-flight routines filled the cabin. Yet something unusual lingered in row 14. The businessman sitting by the window had not relaxed. His body remained tense, his posture rigid, as if the simple presence of the farmer beside him had disrupted the order of his carefully controlled world. Across the aisle, few passengers had begun to notice the subtle discomfort. Not because of loud voices or dramatic gestures, but because of the quiet tension that seemed to ripple through the small space. The farmer, however, remained the same, still patient, almost invisible in his calm. His hands rested on his knees, fingers loosely folded together. His eyes wandered slowly across the cabin with quiet curiosity. For him, the airplane was still a wonder, something far removed from the endless rows of crops and soil he knew so well. Outside the small oval window, the runway lights flickered gently as evening began to settle over the airport. Then the intercom clicked softly. The sound was familiar to frequent travelers. It usually meant a routine message about flight duration or weather conditions, but this time, the voice of the pilot carried a slightly different tone. Calm, measured, thoughtful. The entire cabin grew quiet as passengers listened. The pilot began with the usual greeting, welcoming everyone aboard and thanking them for choosing the airline. His voice was steady, the kind that carried both professionalism and warmth. Yet after the standard introduction, he paused. It was a brief pause, but long enough for several passengers to look up from their phones and magazines. Then the pilot continued. He explained that before takeoff, the crew had received a special request from one of the passengers on board. The words moved carefully through the cabin speakers. Some passengers assumed it was a request for a seat change. Others thought it might involve a medical situation or a travel concern. But the pilot's next sentence made the entire cabin pay attention. The request, he said, was about a passenger who felt uncomfortable sitting next to someone. Because of how they looked, the words floated across the cabin like a quiet ripple through water. A few passengers exchanged puzzled glances in row 14. The businessman felt the air around him suddenly tighten. The pilot continued calmly. He explained that the airline always tries its best to make every passenger comfortable. The crew had carefully checked the available seats on the aircraft to see if a change could be arranged. For a brief moment, the businessman felt a quiet sense of victory. Perhaps the airline understood his concern. Perhaps they would move the farmer to another seat after all. People with status and influence were used to being accommodated. But the pilot had not finished speaking. He explained that most of the aircraft was completely full. However, after reviewing the seating arrangements, the crew had discovered that there was one seat available in the business class section of the plane. The businessman leaned slightly forward. Passengers around him listened closely. The pilot continued, his tone calm but deliberate. He said that the airline would never want a passenger to feel uncomfortable during a flight. For that reason, the crew had decided to offer the available business class seat to the person who had been treated with discomfort. The words settled across the cabin. As passengers blinked in confusion. The businessman's expression slowly shifted. The meaning of the sentence had not yet fully reached him. Then the pilot completed the announcement. The upgraded seat, he explained, would be offered to the farmer sitting in row 14 for a moment. The entire cabin fell into a stunned silence. It was the kind of silence that arrives when something unexpected disrupts the normal order of things. Then, a quiet murmur began spreading through the passengers. Heads turned toward row 14. Some faces showed surprise. Others showed quiet approval. Several passengers even smiled. The flight attendant standing near the aisle gently approached the farmer's seat. Her voice remained soft and respectful as she explained that the crew would be happy to escort him to his new seat in the business class cabin. The farmer looked slightly confused at first. For someone who had never flown before, the idea of moving to a different section of the plane seemed unnecessary. He slowly stood, unsure whether the offer was truly meant for him, but the kindness in the flight attendant's expression made the situation clear. The upgrade was real, and it was being given with respect. The farmer picked up his small bag from the overhead compartment. His movements remained calm and unhurried. The same steady rhythm that had guided him through years of work beneath open skies as he stepped into the aisle. Something unexpected happened. A passenger a few rows behind began to clap softly. Then another, within seconds. The quiet applause spread through the cabin. It was not loud or dramatic, but it carried a powerful message. The businessman in the window seat sat frozen. His face had lost its earlier confidence. The applause was not just for the farmer. It was a response to the moment, a quiet reminder that dignity could not be measured by clothing or wealth. The farmer walked slowly toward the front of the aircraft. Guided by the flight attendant, each step carried him farther from the seat that once rejected him. Yet his expression remained humble. There was no pride, no sense of victory, only quiet gratitude as he disappeared behind the curtain separating economy from business class. The cabin slowly returned to silence. Passengers settled back into their seats. The engines continued humming, but the atmosphere inside the plane had changed. Something deeper than comfort had been addressed. Something about respect. Back in row 14, the businessman stared silently at the empty middle seat beside him. For the first time since boarding the aircraft, he looked uncertain. The journey had not even begun. Yet, already, something within him had been forced to confront a truth he had never expected to face. And the flight was about to reveal something even more surprising about the quiet farmer who had just walked toward the front of the plane. a truth that would make the lesson of this moment impossible to ignore. As the aircraft finally lifted from the runway, the city lights below began shrinking into small glowing patterns across the darkening earth. The powerful engines carried the plane upward through layers of clouds, leaving behind the familiar world of roads, buildings, and fields. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Seatbelt signs glowed softly above the aisle. Flight attendants began preparing the first round of service. Passengers returned to their phones, books, and quiet conversations. But the moment in row 14 had left a lingering impression. Several travelers still thought about the farmer, who had quietly walked toward the front of the plane while the cabin filled with applause. Some admired the airline's decision. Others simply reflected on how easily people could judge one another without knowing a single detail about their lives. The businessman by the window, however, could not return to normal so easily. The empty seat beside him felt strangely heavy. Only minutes earlier, he had viewed the farmer as an inconvenience, a small disruption to his carefully managed comfort. Now the silence beside him carried something deeper. It carried a quiet reminder of his own behavior. Outside the window, the sky had turned dark, leaving only the faint glow of distant cities. Far below, the businessman shifted slightly in his seat. For the first time since boarding the aircraft, he felt a quiet discomfort that had nothing to do with seating arrangements. It was the discomfort of reflection. Meanwhile, beyond the curtains separating economy from business class, the farmer sat quietly in his new seat. The spacious chair felt unfamiliar beneath him. The soft lighting, the wide armrests, the gentle attention from the flight attendants. It was all far removed from the world he knew, yet he remained the same humble man who had walked onto the plane earlier. His hands rested calmly on the armrests as he looked out the window beside him. The clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft, glowing softly under the moonlight. For a moment, his thoughts drifted far away from the airplane. They returned to the land it left behind, to the wide fields where the soil had shaped his life. To the early mornings when the sky slowly brightened over acres of crops that depended on patience, discipline, and hope. The life of a farmer was not one that brought wealth or recognition. It demanded resilience. Seasons could bring success or failure with equal unpredictability. Droughts, storms, shifting markets could erase years of effort in a matter of weeks. But the farmer had endured it all with quiet determination for decades. He had worked land that had been passed down through generations of his family. The soil held stories of hard winters, hopeful springs, and long summers beneath the sun. It had also held memories of sacrifice, because the farmer had never worked only for himself. His labor had always been for someone else, for a child who once walked beside him through those fields, a child who had grown up watching his father rise before sunrise every single day, a child who had learned early that dignity did not come from wealth, but from honest effort. Years earlier, when that child had dreamed of leaving the small farming town to pursue something greater, the farmer had never tried to stop him. Instead, he had quietly supported the dream. The cost had been enormous. Land had been sold. Equipment had been sacrificed. Savings, built over decades, had slowly disappeared. But the farmer had never complained. He had watched proudly as his child studied, trained, and built a life far beyond the boundaries of the farm. And now, after many years, that child had finally asked him to come visit. It was the first time the farmer had ever boarded an airplane. The invitation had arrived with warmth and excitement, a moment of reunion long overdue, as the aircraft continued its journey through the night sky. The farmer remained quietly unaware that his simple story carried more meaning than anyone around him realized. But someone on the plane knew. High above the cabin, inside the cockpit, the pilot guided the aircraft steadily through the clouds. His uniform was crisp, his posture confident as he monitored the instruments glowing across the control panel to the passengers behind the cockpit door. He was simply the voice that had spoken through the intercom earlier. A professional, a captain, a man trusted with the lives of hundreds of travelers. But to one passenger on board, he was something more, much more, because the pilot knew exactly who the farmer was. He had recognized the name on the passenger list long before the plane had even begun boarding. When he saw it, a quiet smile had crossed his face. Not because of status, not because of influence, but because that name belonged to the man who had shaped his entire life. The man who had sacrificed everything so that one small boy from a farming town could grow up and one day fly airplanes across the sky. The farmer sitting quietly in business class was not just another passenger. He was the father of the pilot flying the aircraft, and the announcement made before takeoff had never been random. It had been something far more personal, far more meaningful. Yet the passengers inside the cabin still had no idea the real story of the quiet farmer was about to unfold in a way no one on that flight would ever forget. And the man sitting alone in row 14 was about to witness the final lesson that karma had prepared for him. The aircraft moved steadily through the quiet darkness of the night sky. Far below, cities appeared like distant constellations scattered across the earth, their lights flickering softly beneath the thick blanket of clouds. Inside the cabin, the flight had settled into a calm rhythm. Passengers leaned back in their seats. Some slept. Others watched movies on small, glowing screens, or gazed out of the windows into the endless sky. But the moment that had taken place before takeoff still lingered quietly in the minds of many travelers. In row 14, the businessman remained unusually silent. The empty seat beside him felt like a quiet mirror reflecting his earlier actions. What had seemed like a small inconvenience only an hour earlier had now grown into something far more uncomfortable. The applause from the passengers still echoed faintly in his memory. He shifted slightly in his seat, staring down at his folded hands for a man used to control, influence, and respect. The moment had been deeply unsettling, yet he still did not know the full story. Near the front of the plane, the farmer remained seated in the spacious business-class cabin. The gentle hum of the aircraft surrounded him as he looked out the wide window beside his seat. The clouds below moved slowly like an endless white ocean under the moonlight. For someone who had spent most of his life working beneath the open sky, being above the clouds felt almost unreal. But his thoughts were not focused on the view. They had returned once again to the long journey of his life. Years of labor in the fields, seasons of struggle, moments when the future of the farm had seemed uncertain. Yet through every hardship, one purpose had remained stronger than everything else: his child, a boy who had once run through the tall crops, laughing beneath the summer sun, a boy who had watched airplanes cross the sky and dreamed of flying one someday. The farmer had never laughed at that dream, even when the idea seemed impossible, even when the cost of education meant sacrificing nearly everything he owned. He had believed in that dream, because a father's belief can sometimes carry a child farther than money ever. Kadat the farmer did not know that in just a few minutes, the entire cabin would learn that story. High above the passengers, inside the cockpit, the pilot glanced down at the instruments glowing softly across the control panel. Everything was stable. The aircraft cruised smoothly through the night sky. But his thoughts were not focused entirely on the flight. They had drifted back to the moment earlier that evening when he had seen a familiar name on the passenger list. A name that carried the weight of every sacrifice that had shaped his life. His father, the man who had worked endless days beneath the sun so that his son could someday rise above the clouds. For years, their lives had moved in different directions. The son had traveled across countries, built a career, and flown thousands of passengers safely across the skies. Meanwhile, the father had remained on the farm, continuing the quiet work that had always defined him. But tonight was different. Tonight, the son was flying the plane that carried his father. The pilot reached for the intercom microphone. Soft chime sounded through the cabin. Passengers slowly lifted their heads. The familiar voice of the pilot filled the aircraft once again. But this time, the tone carried something deeper than routine. Professionalism. It carried emotion. He explained that before the flight ended. He wanted to share something personal with everyone on board. Curiosity spread quietly across the cabin. The businessman in row 14 looked up. Passengers leaned slightly forward in their seats. The pilot continued. He said that earlier. Before takeoff, there had been a small situation involving two passengers seated beside each other. Many passengers already remembered the moment clearly, but the pilot explained that the story behind that moment was something far more meaningful. He said that one of the passengers on board was a man who had spent his entire life working the land, a man whose hands had carried the weight of years of hard labor, a man who had sacrificed comfort, wealth, and opportunity so that his child could chase a dream far beyond the boundaries of a small farm. The cabin grew completely silent. Even the businessman in row 14 sat perfectly still. The pilot's voice softened. He explained that the farmer sitting in the business class cabin was not just another passenger. He was his father. The words settled across the aircraft like a wave of quiet emotion. Several passengers glanced toward the front of the plane. Others looked at one another with expressions of surprise and respect. The pilot continued, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. He spoke about growing up in a small farming town where opportunities were limited. He spoke about watching his father work long hours in the fields every single day. He spoke about the sacrifices that had allowed a young boy with a dream of flying airplanes to one day become a pilot. And then he said something that would stay with many passengers long after the flight ended. He said that the man who had been judged earlier for his simple appearance was the reason he was able to stand in the cockpit that night, because true wealth was not measured by suits, watches, or expensive seats on an airplane. True wealth was measured by sacrifice, love, and the quiet strength of people who give everything so that someone else can rise. The cabin remained silent for several seconds. Then something remarkable happened. Applause slowly began spreading through the aircraft. Not loud or dramatic, but sincere. Passengers across the rows clapped with genuine respect. Some wiped away quiet tears. Near the front of the cabin, the farmer lowered his head slightly, overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition. He had never worked for praise. He had never asked for attention. But in that moment, the entire plane understood the value of the life he had lived. Back in row 14, the businessman sat motionless. His earlier judgment now felt painfully small. The empty seat beside him seemed heavier than ever. For the first time in a long time, he understood that status and wealth could not replace something far more powerful. Humility. The aircraft continued its journey across the night sky. But the lesson carried within that flight traveled even farther, because sometimes the people the world overlooks are the very ones who make the greatest impact, and sometimes the greatest stories are written not in offices or boardrooms, but in quiet fields beneath the sun.